This is the book of the generations of Adam, and the day that God created man. In the likeness of God made he him. Male and female created he them, and blessed them, and called their name Adam, in the day when they were created. And Adam lived 130 years, and begat a son in his likeness, after his image, and called his name Seth. And the days of Adam, after he had begotten Seth, were 800 years, and he begat sons and daughters. And all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. And Seth lived 105 years, and begat Enos. And Seth lived, after he begat Enos, 807 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. And Enos lived 90 years, and begat Canaan. And Enos lived, after he begat Canaan, 815 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Enos were 905 years, and he died. And Canaan lived 70 years, and begat Mahalaleel. And Canaan lived, after he begat Mahalaleel, 840 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Canaan were 910 years, and he died. And Mahalaleel lived 65 years, and begat Jared. And Mahalaleel lived, after he begat Jared, 830 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Mahalaleel were 895 years, and he died. His name is repeated more than anyone else. It says in verse number 18, and Jared lived 162 years after he begat Enoch. And Jared lived, after he begat Enoch, 800 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. And Enoch lived 65 years, and begat Methuselah. And Enoch walked with God, after he begat Methuselah, 300 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. And Methuselah lived 187 years, and begat Lamech. And Methuselah lived, after he begat Lamech, 782 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. And Lamech lived 182 years, and begat a son, and he called his name Noah, saying, This same shall comfort us concerning our work and toil of our hands, because of the ground which the Lord hath cursed. And Lamech lived, after he begat Noah, 595 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. And Noah was 500 years old, and Noah begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So, going from gleanings from Genesis, we're going to look at this, and obviously I took my time trying to read those very slowly so I could try pronouncing them with 100% accuracy, and I'm not sure I did. No offense to Mahalaleel. But we're going to look through here some just quick points here about some gleanings from this chapter. Obviously, when it gets to genealogies, there's obviously the interesting fact that, hey, men and women had babies. That's pretty cool from that. But more than that, we're going to look at the testimonies of the genealogies, and we're going to look at some different things here towards it. First of all, we have to remember when we read this that the Bible was not written chronologically. In other words, we don't read from Genesis and it's everything in concurrent fashion of all what happened. In fact, arguably, the first book of the Bible written was Job. Was the actual first book of the Bible was written was Job. We can actually go back and read Genesis chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, all the way through. We don't see Job mentioned much in there at all. But we do believe that he was somewhere in there in the time frame. Of course, we know Genesis through, excuse me, Genesis through Deuteronomy was written by Moses. So he was the human pen by which we have the Bible today, the first 5 books, which is why they're also called the writing of Moses or the law of Moses, because it's what Moses had written, obviously being led by God. But when we start realizing here the testimony of the genealogies is that it's not, they begat sons and daughters, their children, they had their sons and daughters, and it's written in through there. I know a lot of times people want to argue, where did Cain get his wife from? I was talking to a guy Sunday, and he wanted to find out where Cain got his wife. I was like, God gave him to him. God gave him a wife. And he had a hard time with that because, people have a hard time answering that question. And we can honestly look back and tell you what the answer is. Obviously, God didn't have a law against incest, as it were, back at that time. There was a pure race. There was no issue towards that. And we can strain at it. We don't have to make any apologies for the Bible. After the fact, God does have a problem with it, but he didn't have a problem with it in the very beginning because it was controlled. It was how he was set up from there. Set up how God wanted it. So obviously we see that, but they begat sons and daughters. And I find interesting in chapter 5, there's no mention of Cain. There's no more mention of Abel from, in chapter 5 of Genesis, but it mentions Seth. So it makes you stop and remember that there was sons and daughters that were born even after just Seth. How many sons did Adam have? Well, he had 3. Well, yes, he had 3, but he had much more than 3. And so a lot of times people have a hard time catching on to that, and they think that Adam only had 3 sons. There was just like Adam, Eve, and then there was Seth. And then from that started this whole twisted family. No. So there's a lot of issue towards that, but there was obviously more sons and daughters that were along the way. But you can go back and you see they're traced in generations. When the Bible goes back, a lot of times they trace in generations and not years. Even in Genesis chapter 5, and every time you see genealogies that are written, it's traced in genealogies and not always years. Look at Matthew chapter 1, for instance. Matthew chapter 1. And this is interesting because, when you start going back to genealogy, and this is also why God says don't mess with endless genealogies, right? Avoid the genealogies because it just leads to vanity and strife. But it says here in Matthew chapter 1, in verse 1, the book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now, obviously, Abraham was not David's grandfather or Abraham's father, right? So it's skipping back to generations. There's 14 generations from Abraham until David, and 14 generations from David until Joseph. I think measurements go, maybe 28. But it says, and Abraham begat Isaac, and Isaac begat Jacob, and Jacob begat Judas and his brethren. Obviously, when we look at this thing here, it's Judah, right? And Judah begat Phares and Zerah of Tamar, and Phares begat Estrom, and Estrom begat Aram, and Aram begat Abinadab, and Abinadab begat Nason, and Nason begat Salmon, and Salmon begat Boaz of Rahab, and Boaz begat Obed of Ruth, and Obed begat Jesse, and Jesse begat David the king, and of course you go from there. So you just see this as but it's traces by generations and not by years. We go back and we say, okay, well, I was born, Lakemore was founded in 1970. So we're going to go back and find the history of Lakemore to 1970. Or America, the country, has its origins from 1776. And it was first discovered in 1492. It was discovered long before that. But but unless it was discovered by a white European, it doesn't matter. But that's a little sarcasm. I should stop doing that. But you find here it's the generations of Jesus Christ, and it talks back about the generations of Jesus Christ. And so a lot of times we go back and we find it. You're not always measured by calendar years. When referring to history, it goes back to a time period in history. It doesn't go back to a certain date, like 1492, 1611. whatever different, it doesn't always go back to a number date, but it goes back to a time of genealogies. For instance, go back to Luke chapter 2. Here's another instance of it. Luke chapter 2. I'm not saying it always happens, because there's other places in the Bible we can find that, but I find that most of the time when it's dealing with a Jewish background or a historical from a Jewish point of view, and I say Jewish, not like the religion, but from the race, that I think that we come down to it, we we can find that through the same way. I think it's actually in, not chapter 1, let's go to chapter number 2. Here's one that we find that was measured in years, or in reference. It's just referencing back to a certain time in history, right? And it came to pass in those days, there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. Now this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria. So now he's going back to a certain reference time, to a certain area, to a historical figured point that was common to that thing. And here you find it had to be something that was known abroad, because Luke is writing this and he's talking about what happened to Theophilus, and he's writing this as like, hey, this is what's going on. You have a little bit of history, a little bit of knowledge of what's going on. So he's going from that point of view. He's coming from that era, pointing to a historical thing that happened. Yesterday I was talking to some guys across away from me, and they were working with like abstinence, trying to get kids to sign up to pledge not to be tobacco free. Now it's funny, this 4-year-old sitting there like, it's kind of funny. One kid came up and he was supposed to sign a pledge. He goes, "Well, I like hot sauce," but it was just kind of like they literally didn't understand it, But we were talking afterwards, and one of the guys was like, "Yeah." The guy was like, "Whatever happened with 9/11 anyway?" This kid, the teenager, was like, "Whatever happened with 9/11?" And we're like, "Wow." Like, they don't even know what happened with 9/11. It's been 20 years. And there's people out there that don't know what happened with 9/11. They weren't around for 9/11. It made me feel old. And then the guy outside was doing a puppet show, and he was playing Fresh Prince of Bel-Air theme song. And it got me thinking, this thing came out in like 91, 92, or whatever, how old it was. And I'm like, I remember when it came out, and this guy that I'm talking to wasn't there when it came out. He considered it an oldie. Like oldies, like the Beatles or Beach Boys are oldies. This is not oldies. This is. I'm like, wow, this is good. When you can look back and remember things, and they say it's oldies, I'm like, wow, this is bad. But look at Luke chapter number 3. Now again, it doesn't go back and say AD, BC, because it was the dating of years like that wasn't. AD, BC, whatever, it wasn't listed until the Romans, right? But it says here in chapter 3, now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, and Herod being the tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea, and of the region of Tyrannosaurus Rex. What? Tetrarchus and wow, I can't read it. Anyways, he's reading through here, and he's mentioning back, saying these are the years of their reigns. So it's going back to a historical time frame, but it doesn't go back to an actual decade, year, going through there, right? So the Jewish history has always gone back to generations, to the time of so-and-so, to the time of such and such. So that's a pretty cool, interesting thing I found by that. Years were always measured by calendars when referencing history. So a lot of times, even when you go back and you find, I think Bob and I were talking a couple weeks ago, and we were looking at one of the king's reigns. Was it Jeroboam? Jehoiakim. He was one of the kings, and it came a discrepancy as far as years. Like it says he reigned this, and then he began to reign, and then it says he reigned so many years. And it was like, wait a second, there's like a 10 or 12 year slide. Like, where did this come from? And then you go back and read it again. You read it from if it's in Kings, it's in Chronicles, right? So he's reading it through there, and it's basically saying when he started reigning with his father, being like a co-king under his father, a grandfather, and he became the king after his father died. And there's that discrepancy. But a lot of times, this is where a lot of questions rise up from the Bible when it comes to age and dating, because they didn't have a 1997 expiration stamp. or anything marked. It was always written with what was going around that time of day. Go to Daniel chapter number 10. This is another interesting one. This is nothing deep, but it's fascinating to study. Here's another idea of it too. So here's Daniel writing from it, but he's right now. Daniel, of course, is writing in it from a Hebrew standpoint, but he's also writing it from the genealogy standpoint of Chaldeans. In fact, the book of Daniel is written in Chaldeans, not written in Hebrew. It's written in Chaldeans, right? Verse number 10, chapter 10, verse 1. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a thing was revealed unto Daniel, whose name was called Belshazzar, and the thing was true, but the time appointed was long, and he understood the thing, and he had understanding of the vision. In those days I, Daniel, was mourning 3 full weeks. I ate no pleasant bread, neither came flesh or wine into my mouth, neither did I anoint myself at all, till 3 whole weeks were past. And in the 24th day of the 1st month, now he's mentioning actually days of when it took place, and I was by the side of the great river, which is Hiddekel. But if you notice, he's going back there and he's mentioning something that took place, but he's writing it from a place of, not from a Jewish background, from a Hebrew background, but more from a Chaldean background, from a more, I'm not saying civilized society, but more from a different approach of how they measured, right? So a lot of times when we go through that, some people look back in genealogies, this is from my forefathers. Well, how many fathers do you get? But it's like they go back and they think back towards, you get it? Forefathers? No? Okay. So they go back and they think about it from a historical standpoint. It's never just dates and years and months. Sometimes it's eras or periods of history that are essential to a person's reign or to a family member being alive, things like that. Okay? There is mud. So we find that testimony of the genealogies, this is why it was so important, that leading up to Christ, the genealogies were more intact. The genealogies were kept records, but then after the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, there was no more genealogies really kept. Everything got spread abroad, burnt with fire. There was no actual go-back records and saying this is how it was, except which was already written, manuscripted, documented down. Well, why is that? Because it just showed the Messiah had come. And it gives testimony to Christ the Messiah had come. But you can't go back anywhere further. You can't go back and say, we were the children of Israel by birth. There's no records of that. Even with, find that with Ezra, you find that with Nehemiah. There was a lot of questionings, who comes where. There's a lot of impure marrying going on and mixed multitudes. And even with Nehemiah and with Ezra, especially with Ezra, where there were strange wives, and they had to put their strange wives from out among them, and it was polluting the seed line. It was polluting it. But there was always that righteous remnant. So this is a really important when looking back at genealogies. We don't study it out. I'm sorry, what's that family, that Ancestry.com. I'm sorry, it's not super necessary. We can't go back and verify every bit of our bloodline, but we can take it by faith and realizing that what God said is true and the Messiah did come, which is one of the reasons of the genealogies. All right? So let's look at here. Number 2, the second point I want to show now is a testimony of godliness. The testimony of godliness. So obviously, going back in Genesis, going back to Genesis chapter number 5. We find that this guy is, as we have the history from Adam going forward through here, we find that there was the promise of the seed, right? Chapter number 3, it says in verse 15, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, between thy seed and her seed. It doesn't say thy seed Adam. He's talking to the serpent, right? So he's saying into her seed, not Adam's seed, which is important to realize. And it shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. So obviously it's talking about a seed that's going to come forth. It's not of man's doing, but it's of God's doing. But we see it, though we start going through chapter 5, and we find this righteous seed line, or this testimony of good seed, or goodly seed. And we find here that they had other sons and daughters mentioned by generality. In verse number 4, and the days of Adam after he had begotten Seth were 800 years, and he begat sons and daughters. And all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. So you find there was mention by generality. A lot of times when God's not being specific about something, it's not good to be dogmatic where the Bible is not dogmatic. So there's a lot of times people will go through there and they try to make more doctrine out of it. They try taking more than what's there. Adam had more children than just what was mentioned, but Seth was the person that was seated. You can see through other passages, through this whole chapter going through there, even with Noah, there was other brothers or sisters that Noah had. But Noah is the central figure, right? So we find that. But it was specific through Seth. The seed line had been preserved through a righteous remnant. Now, as we go down through some a little bit more, we start realizing this with Enoch. Excuse me. And we go down to verse number 19. Sorry, verse number 18. And Jared lived 162 years, and he begat Enoch. And Jared lived after he begat Enoch 800 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Jared were 962 years. 962 years. That's crazy. Now remember this too. When you study through the Bible, when I was younger, I always thought like there was Abraham, he lived and died. And then there was Isaac, he lived and died. And then there was Jacob, he lived and died. Then you start to realize that Adam probably knew his grandkids. Right? The Bible's not, okay, linear, stop, boom. It's like here, and then it started here, and here. Like a bar graph, it goes on. So they knew each other. Could you imagine Adam sitting down, family reunion, sitting down together, and then here comes Noah, comes and sit on Adam's lap, and starts talking to him, and then Noah's got to remember that, and here he comes a serpent trying to slither in the ark. Could you imagine that little bit right there? I'm like, could you imagine that? Grandpa, great grandfather Adam, why did you name it Mosquito? I didn't. I called it some Latin name. But anyways, but Enoch, here we find here with him, he walked with God. It says there in verse 24, and Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. So he was obviously raptured out of the world. He didn't die, even though his years were total 365 when he was taken, but he did not die. So when you think about this, we're going to live most likely, unless something goes wrong. I've heard this preached, for at least 30 years of my life that I paid attention to, at least. Because, when you're 11 years old, you don't always pay attention. Especially when you're 7 or 6. This happens. But, we're likely the last generation. It's likely, I know, like 60 years from now, Daniel's going to get up there. Oh, I remember it was a Wednesday night. And that old date setter got up and said, this is the last generation, and here y'all is. Anyways. So we can't ever say for sure, but I honestly believe this is the last generation. Things are, the world is going through a rapid decline. Things are getting worse. But our fellowship with God can be such a thing in this day and age, in our lifetime, that it impacts the remembrance that is left in the world. That they don't have to know us for, hey, this guy hit the biggest, longest home run in history, or this guy hit the most home runs in baseball, or this guy ran the fastest, or this guy won the most titles in a swimming event, or this person did so many high jumps, or this person quit on her gymnastics team for a little bit because of mental health issues, and then she got back and won bronze. And however we look back at, I'm using the Olympics obviously because it's kind of memorable, right? We kind of remember some things that went on through. I remember no one wanted to get in the pool after Greg Louganis split his blood everywhere. But when we go through our life, people look back at our life and look back at the legacy we live. What do they say? There's famous Americans known for their contribution. There's famous Americans known for, hey, Thomas Paine. There's, his contributions to writing literature, like Common Sense. That was not very common sense at all. But little things that was written, Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, who discovered electricity, and all these different... Huh? What'd I say? Is it the same thing? No? Okay. But it's like, there's different people have different members for different things they do. What about famous scientists? Okay, Eli Whitney, the cotton gin, steam engine, Robert Fuller, right? Diesel engine, Pasteur, all these different scientists. Einstein, what did he discover? Newton discovered gravity. All these different people going through what they learned and what they contributed to in their lifetime, and that's all they have to remember themselves by. Yeah. Enoch, his remembrance that people go back to look at as he walked with God. It wasn't even that God took him, and that was pretty important that God took him. But it was like Enoch walked with God. That's why God took him. It wasn't like God took him and he walked with God. The cause and effect, thinking about that he walked with God. We live in a day where, man, walking with God is hard to do at times, with all the world screaming at us and allurements and the busyness of schedule, and be able to travel 900 miles an hour and be, to and fro and travel and have all the access to the technology at our fingertips. We have so much things screaming at us and taking our time away. But think about this. Enoch walked with God. No one before, since Adam in the garden, was known for walking with God. Now, men began to call upon the name of the Lord in Genesis chapter 3. But we don't find anyone before or anyone after coming to the place where they literally walked with God, to such a point where God took them. It's been how many years since creation? 66 what? 66. Well, unless it's older. I don't know. But it's like, I'm joking there when I'm saying that. But we go through, let's say for 6,300 years, let's say 6,200 years, 61, however long it's been since Enoch walked with God, no one else through Scripture has been taken because they walk with God. The world's not getting better and better. With all the freedom, with all the knowledge of God that we have, with all the teachings, with all the great sermons that have been preached, all the great Christian literature that's been passed on from generation to generation, we as Christians, we as believers, haven't gotten more powerful. We've gotten more distant. The knowledge, hey, Bob, he walked with God. Eka, yeah, he walked with God. And that's the thing he holds on to. That's the thing we hold back onto. Adam, yes, he was taken, but he was taken. God took him because he walked with God. The Bible says in the New Testament he was translated, for God translated him. Right? But you know what? He walked with God. That's a testimony that we can have. No matter what. Now, they grabbed me this past week. I can have all the biggest sales awards. I can win the biggest push contest. I can sell the most in history. I can be known all around the world. I can have this title. I can have that. I can have this fame, that fame, this infamy, this derogatory name thrown at me, whatever it is. All these things that we have, but at the end of the day, if we're not known for our walk with God, what are we known for? The just shall live by faith. What is your generation going to say? What is the legacy of your generation? What is the legacy of even in this church? Tim was a great soul winner. And Tim was more than Tim being a soul winner, not talking about myself, Tim Cathone. More than Tim Cathone being a great soul winner, he was a great friend. He was a person, he was a sounding board. He could keep secrets. He could sit there and just be a rock and let you talk at him. And it let you know how you feel, let him know what's in your head, or just bounce the things off. And he would just sit there, and then he would forget you even mentioned it. He was a great sounding board. I could say, hey, Tim, I think this, hey, this is what I think I want to do, guys. And maybe this, and while we're all talking fellowship and chit-chatting, Tim was back there making notes, figuring how to make it happen. Tim was like the XO. I mean, he was just the guy behind the scenes, but he was more than just a soul winner. That's what we recognize him as. Just a lot of people recognize him for as being a great soul winner. I think he was just an all-around great guy. He was a help. He was my second. He was a second man. He was my second right-hand man. I had Ed, I had Tim, and I was good to go. I mean, that was awesome. And then when people move out and people die off and people things change out, and it's like more people have stepped in and become more of that. And I'm thankful for that. Jack was my song leader, and it just never seemed to go. It was great, thanking God for his service, but it just wasn't the same. And now for the past 3 years, it's been Daniel for the past 3 years, and watching him grow into that role. But Daniel's not the song leader. Daniel's Daniel, right? He's coming to his own by preaching, but all that. But looking back at what you at the legacy you leave for each other, the legacy we leave for our families, our friends, our coworkers. He walked with God. When a man's ways please the Lord, he maketh even his enemies to be at peace with him. Even his enemies could sit back and say, Enoch, he walked with God. He's not in a spaceship flying out there with Elvis and Jimmy Hoffa flying around. No, God took him. God took him. God didn't take him off the face of the earth out of punishment. He just walked with God, and God says, come out of here. It doesn't say that in Greek or Hebrew, but you get the point of it, right? Here he is, God translated, and God took him. But he walked with God. I want to have that reputation. And I'm not trying to say it vainly or to be proud of it, but I'm saying I would love for people to sit back and say, yeah, he was a great guy, he loved his wife. You know what? I'm glad I love my wife. Hope my wife knows that I love her. If not, the beatings will continue until morale improves. But I love my wife. I love my kids. But I don't want to be known for a great father or being a great husband if I'm not known as someone who walked with God. And that's a shame, because if I died and at my funeral someone stood up and said, oh, he was a great guy, nice, boy, he was just so helpful, so pleasant, except in church. He was all this, that, and the other. But if no one could stand up and truly say without being deceitful and could honestly say, he walked with God. What is my life? What good did I do? Look at the vanity of the generations that have followed since. David, man after God's own heart. Okay, I'll give him that one. Abraham, friend of God. Okay, I'll give him that one. Well, this was the example falling through my teeth. Job, a perfect man, one that feared God, eschewed evil. Add your epitaph. When it's all been said and done, what is going to be said for you? He walked with God. That's a challenge for me. But anyways, that's all I got for you tonight. Hope it's a blessing. Hope it's an encouragement on a nice Wednesday night. Let's take time and pray.